Have you ever come across a machine that you couldn't fix for some reason or another? If you have, then consider yourself lucky because you're about to experience a moment you're not going to forget for a long time. If you couldn't tell from that introduction, this apparently is one of those moments. And even though I enjoy doing this hobby, this is one of those times where I start to question my abilities, and you're about to see why. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very orange and gray string trimmer, and the problem is that it won't stay running. The worst part was that before they gave it to me to fix, they made an attempt to fix it themselves, and well, they didn't put everything back. I don't mind if you try and fix it, but please put it back, otherwise it'll make it tougher for the next person, and they might just end up charging you more for the work. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, typically the first thing I'd want to check is that the engine is not worn out by pulling on the rope. However, as you can tell, that's not going to work on this one, and the reason is because the spark plug is missing. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to install a different spark plug as a stand-in, but this may be a bad idea, and you'll see what I mean. Now, with the spark plug back into the engine, we can now see how much the engine is fighting back, and I'm pretty happy to say it's fighting back very well. That means the engine is not worn out and is not causing the problem we have with it. So as you just saw, the engine started and ran while it was choked, which is not supposed to happen that way, but as soon as the choke was moved to the next position, the engine stopped. Next, I want to pour out the fuel, that way we can inspect it for any issues that it might have, but that's when we get a surprise. After pouring it out into a glass jar, that's when we notice that the fuel filter is sitting in the jar as well. Now the filter is important to the system because it keeps the carb from being clogged up with debris. Now most times when the filter has come loose like this, it means the fuel lines are starting to break down and needs to be replaced. Of course, fuel lines won't last forever, but if you use good gasoline, and by that I mean 100% gasoline with no ethanol, they'll last quite a long time. Unfortunately, I do believe they've been using ethanol gasoline, which does work, but it does take a huge toll on the entire fuel system. And it's pretty clear as to what it can do to the fuel lines as they break as I disconnect them from the carb. Now, if your only choice is to use ethanol gasoline, what I would do would be to drain the fuel from the system between uses. I know that's a huge pain to do, but doing that is certainly a lot easier and cheaper to do than what I'm about to do now. So as you can tell, I'm taking the carb apart and inspecting it for a clogged inlet screen and for bad diaphragms. Now this one is the pumping diaphragm, and you're mainly concerned with the check valve flaps, but in this case both are in great shape. After that, we'll then check the inlet screen for any debris, which is the last line of defense if your fuel filter should happen to fall off, which of course this one did. Now surprisingly, there is no debris on the inlet screen, which can only mean one thing: the filter only recently fell off and it was not ran like this. The next step is to look at the metering diaphragm, and what we find there is just what you'd expect. The diaphragm is no longer supple and easy to move, and it's even gotten a couple of wrinkles in it. Now, it's not in terrible shape, but it's also not what I would call usable either, so we'll need to replace it. So this is when things get a bit interesting. I chose to replace the carb instead of trying to service it, and I did this for a couple of reasons. Now the kit I received also came with fuel lines, which we need, extra gaskets, and even a fuel filter. The only part that I wish was included was the air filter, but we'll worry about that another day. Now since we needed so many parts from the spark plug to the fuel tank components, this seemed to be a better way than sourcing the parts separately. Now this is a very risky thing to do, and that's because most all aftermarket parts, except for some, can't match the quality of an OEM part. So first up, we're going to replace those broken fuel lines, and cutting them at an angle will help out tremendously. Also, having some really good pliers helps out as well, but it's not needed. However, you'll need to find a way to pull the fuel line into the tank. Now the first line that I'm going to run will be the fuel filter line, so it'll need to be long enough for us to pull out of the tank. That way we can cut off the angle piece and then install the fuel filter. Now I decided to use the one from the kit, but reusing the old one would have been fine too, just so long as there's no corrosion on the metal parts. Now this part is very important, as you're going to see later on. Make sure the fuel filter is resting at the lower front part of the fuel tank. This will ensure that it's able to pick up as much fuel as possible, otherwise the fuel system isn't going to work. Next, we're going to install the return line using the very same method, except we don't need to make the line as long as the filter line. I would recommend leaving at least an inch of fuel line, if not more, in the fuel tank, just to make sure that it's not going to come out by itself. Once the new fuel lines have been ran, we can then worry about the carb, and don't forget about the throttle cable as well. Just make sure that you don't forget which fuel line is which, because mixing them up will have some bad results later on. So on this particular carb, the fuel filter line will go on the brass port furthest away from the bulb. Of course, that means the return line will connect to the port closer to the bulb. Once the fuel lines have been connected to the carb, we'll then need to put some fuel into the tank so that we can test the fuel flow. So when pressing on the bulb, fuel should travel up the filter line into the carb, fill the bulb, and then return back to the tank through the return line. And as you can see, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, which is great news. Just on a side note, there should be no fuel coming out of the carb when pressing on the bulb. Just remember, this bulb is meant to purge the air from the system. It's not meant to prime the engine with any fuel. Now, if your fuel is not flowing through the lines, you'll have to check on the carb for an air leak. The same situation goes for if your fuel is slow to move through the lines and you're having to press on the bulb too much. Now, most times you don't have to worry about this if you're installing a brand new carb, but it can still happen. Now, before we go any further, I would like to examine the spark arrestor screen in the outlet of the muffler. Just as its name says, it's meant to stop sparks from coming out of the muffler. However, if it's clogged, it could cause running problems. But as you can see, it's not clogged at all, and it's more wet with oil from the fuel system, which should disappear as soon as the engine starts running again. Now, the very last item I want to address is the pull rope. Now, it's not broken, but I do think it's a bit shorter than I want it to be. Now, the person who's going to be using this trimmer is very tall and has quite the reach, so I think giving them about another foot of pull rope might be nice. I do have to let you know that when dealing with the pull rope, be very careful, and that's because it is spring-loaded and could get you hurt. Now, this one has a larger spring on it to help make it easier to pull over, so yours may not have one. So after pulling all the rope out, which will then wind the spring up, I'll then keep the pulley from turning by jamming it with a couple of screwdrivers. Next, we'll pull out the end of the rope out of the pulley that has the knot on it, cut it off, and then pull out all the old rope. We'll then carefully push the new pull rope through the old handle and then the loose end through the opening in the cover and the pulley, make a knot, and then seat it. Just be careful and not use too thick of a rope because there's only so much room on the pulley, and if you make the rope not only longer but thicker, it will bind up on you. Once the new knot is seated in the pulley, hold onto the rope so it won't wind up, then release the screwdrivers and then slowly allow the pulley to wind up the rope. Now, there are many different ways to change the rope, but I find this way to be a lot easier to do, but you may not feel the same way about it. Now, I would have liked to clean up that pulley because of all that grease that was on it, but that grease is there for the larger pulley, so we'll have to leave it on there for now. And it's always a good idea after having worked on the recoil to check and make sure that it's still working, otherwise you might get a surprise when you try and start it for the first time. Once the new rope has been installed on the pulley, we'll then install the recoil back onto the machine and get ready to start the trimmer. However, this is when things go incredibly wrong, but I am getting ahead of myself. Now, even though this is a brand new carb, the trimmer is not new. That means we might have to make some adjustments to the carb to get it to work with the engine. Now, the screw that's closer to the engine is for low speed fuel adjustment, basically for the engine to idle, but also for quick trigger squeezes. And the screw closer to the air filter is for high speed fuel adjustment, or basically while the trigger is fully squeezed for long periods. It's also best to adjust the high speed screw while you have the trigger fully squeezed, but that is only a recommendation. And the last screw is the idle set screw, and this will help determine your idle speed. However, we won't have to worry about this until we get it running. So unfortunately, the engine did not want to stay running, which is not too big of a surprise. Now, since the engine stopped when I moved the choke to half choke, I'm guessing it wants more fuel. So in this case, I'll turn the low speed fuel adjustment screw counterclockwise a quarter turn and then try that again. Well, this time it didn't do anything, but when I looked in the fuel tank, that's when I noticed that the filter had come out of the fuel. Now, this happened when I was handling the trimmer and I turned it up on its end at some point. So I'll push the filter back into place, purge the air again, and then try starting it one more time. Now that was a promising start, and it looks like I just need to do more tuning, but unfortunately I was very wrong. So this went on several more minutes, but it kept doing the same thing. I even went so far as to replace that spark plug, but there was still no change. So basically, no matter what I did, it would run and then fall flat on its face. There must be something seriously wrong with this engine, and I wasn't able to adjust the carb to work around it. The other possibility is that the new carb was the problem, but I had to fix the old carb and try it out to be able to come up with a better conclusion. I really do hate repairs like this, but this is where we have to leave it until I get more time with it. So my question is pretty simple. Do you think there's a problem with the engine, or do you think the aftermarket carb is to blame?
Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.